I would encourage you to explore a lot of the paper mills' websites, quoted and unquoted, because there's some amazing stuff that you can take advantage of. Order rate, people, most of the time, I can't speak for anybody else, but some of the material that we have, it's not like we're going to charge you for it or anything like that. So, you know who probably does that? New Page. I'm kidding. Edit that out. If we think about paper, the skeleton and fiber, just grab that, or fiber being the skeleton. The image that you're seeing up here is a cross section. So it's this, magnified many, many times over. So on coated paper, if you think about the fiber as the skeleton and what that brings to, as far as the attributes go, the bulk that Mike Cooper just talked about, stiffness and opacity, all play a key. So, and then you think about coating on it, being the skin, and why is that important? So, how smooth it's going to be, and that will give you a greater, sharper dot. You know, so if you have a hard gloss surface and it's more sealed, we'll get into this a little bit more, but that'll help reproduce a sharper dot for better detail. Important to note, very important to note, can't stress it enough. In the paper world that I grew up in, and probably many of you did, is we had standards given to us by an organization called AF&PA. It's the American Forest Products Association. And it goes back many, many, many decades. And what AF&PA told us was, here's how we categorize paper. It's a number 1 if the GE brightness is X. At one point, it kept changing. So they gave us a number and said 90. If it's 90 or above that, that's a number 1 paper. If it's 85 to 88, whatever it is, brightness, that's a number 2, and down the scale you go. All of that changed well over a decade ago now when we brought in papers from Europe and Asia. Every mill of manufacture, depending on if the origin is the way they measure is different in Europe, the way they measure in Asia would be different, and in the U.S.
It's kind of like metric versus regular. I mean, it's literally totally different scales. So they might call a 94 might be a 90 on our scale. So they might use CIE versus GE. I mean, literally, it's that. That's probably the best analogy to say. It's like comparing the metric system to our regular system. So.
And that's important to know because and I still say, oh, that's number 1, and that's number 2, and that's number 3. It's important to know that because if you're talking to someone, say one of your print sales reps, and they recommend this is a number 1, and they hand you a European sheet, and we make European papers, and Mike is going to show you some of those in a minute. I wouldn't put that as it's a beautiful sheet of paper, but I wouldn't call it a number 1 just because it's above a 90 brightness. You have to, consider the fiber content and things like that. We're going to get into more of that. But that's important to know. There's no global standard for the industry. You have to ask the question, what's the mill of manufacture? Where was it made? And one of the things that the industry as a whole, but we move very, very slowly, that we would like to be able to come up with a measurement, would be in how much color can you reproduce on that surface and put a number to it. And that's going to take a really long time. So the whole world can speak in CIE and be able to communicate on the same page.
That'll never happen.
Yeah, it'll be a long time.
And the further complicated, the government specs have literally not changed in 20, 25 years. So what they call a number 1 in their own A260 or whatever thing they want to put out to the printers and to the community, there's not, I mean, everything's so past that. What we would call a 3 or a fighter grade exceeds what they would put as a number 1 spec. So it's even a slippery slope when you start talking about how the government classifies papers. Because it really kind of mirrored what the AFPA did, and they haven't changed it in 20 plus years. Think about how much products have changed in 20 plus years. So.
You really need to think about what your ultimate goal is as far as the imagery that you're going to reproduce, what your mind's eye says it should look like. And then when you think about the substrates, you've got to ask all the questions. What can I use that's going to make it X, rather than X? So there's a number of characteristics that will impact printed image. And brightness may be important to you, shade may be important to you, the caliper to you, depending on what the job is. And all of those features coming together will have an impact on what you're ultimately going to print. One of the, and this is pretty basic, so I'm sorry if I'm talking about something that you're well aware of, but I wanted to stress it anyway. Especially when we talk about GE brightness. Mike just said, and we measure in GE, General Electric, scientific measurement on how the paper reflects off of the surface. And in Europe, they have the ISO something. So the numbers are completely different. And I know when you went through the session before this, you got into color theory and the impact of light sources and that sort of thing. But if you think about ink film, it is transparent. So you're laying down a layer of ink, the light that goes to the sheet and bounces back off again, the shade of that substrate is going to have a definite impact on what that ink is going to, how that's going to be reproduced as far as what your eye can see. So the brighter the paper, the brighter your inks will appear, and highlights only as bright as your paper. It's kind of like that. But that is a measurement. So GE, I think it's at a 75-degree angle or something. And so it's a scientific measurement. And then if you think about shade, you have brightness, whiteness, and shade, and they're all three completely different. And there is a measurement for this, but I'm not even going to try to explain it because I don't understand it myself. But if you think about shade, it's what the eye can see, so it's visual. And if everything that we saw was in GE brightness, the only thing we would see would be the blue portion of that spectrum. So it's important to understand those differences.
And again, when you go to shade in certain countries, like in South America, for example, they go so blue that it's almost a purplish hue to it. But so many people today pick the stocks based on just blank stocks. They put two things next to each other. Oh, that one's white. And a lot of times, you put too much blue. You have blue, it makes something look whiter. But you have blue to the point where it's almost a purplish hue. When you print, it distorts the images. So you really have to, when you're doing it, you really want to see printed samples and just not just, oh yeah, this one's whiter, I want this one. That's kind of, unfortunately, where it's going in our community. People just look at the blank sheet. You've got to look a little bit further than that. Because ultimately you're buying printing, you're not buying blank people. So you really want to see how it's going to look like that. If that makes sense.
We did not include, because in respect for your time, we could have stayed in this first section much longer. But some of the other attributes that were out here were opacity, stiffness, smoothness, uniformity. All of those things are key. And opacity, if you don't know what it is, I presume it's that's another measurement, and it is see-through. How opaque or not is the sheet. You don't want to read page 5 when you're still on 3. And then bulk and caliper, all of those things for the stiffness of the sheet, especially if you're going to do direct mail, and you need to understand what those measurements are all about. And then surface uniformity, from especially if we're talking about a coated sheet of paper, hills and valleys in the paper, you're going to end up seeing paper model, or you're going to have that image that looks almost parchment. You don't have that uniformity across the sheet. So all of those things play a big part. The other thing, of course, are finish considerations, and Mike touched on that a little bit. When do you use a gloss versus a silk versus a matte? Why are they different? How are they different? Why should you pair? As we talked about in the calorie process, we kind of went through that. One of the things that Mike pointed out was, consider the number of nips that it goes through and what that impact is. If you think about the gloss, and I always try to get this up very visual, so if you think about a pane of glass that you would have in your hand, and you have an ink dropper or an eyedropper with ink in it, and you squeeze it onto the pane of glass, it will just bubble and sip, right? It's not going to seep. Do that same thing to a paper towel. Get that in your head, you know, and that's gonna spread, right? So two different ends of the spectrum, huge impact on what the ultimate image will look like.
Yeah, if you open your McCoy book, if you look at that, I think it's the second page, it was kind of show you the differences. So you really, this highlights it there. It's hard to just, you know, look at a screen here, but you can look at the differences that anyone not have.
You have some idea?
Yeah.
As Mike's passing those around, one of the attributes, obviously, with gloss papers is it is the smoothest, least porous, and it has everything to do with that calendaring process. So it's not an open sheet. So if you're going to reproduce things like you can read up here, I don't need to read the screen to you, that, you know, shiny objects. And I have a couple of pieces that I think are pretty good examples, and McCardle, I'm sure, you know, could offer you dozens and dozens more of things that they've produced here. But this piece I'm going to pass around, I told Naomi when we hit the lottery we're going shopping. But this I think is a really nice example of when you might want to consider using a gloss surface because you want that pop and to reproduce the images of the jewelry. So that's an example. If you read the next one. If you look at silk and dull finishes, I want to just spend a little bit more time on this. We talked about the calendaring process. On a dull finish, it's not going to go through as many nips. At Sappi, our silk finish, we have a silk and a dull in our lineup of products. And on the silk finish, we actually have that go through one of the drums in that calendar stack it emboss or debosses the sheet, like tiny, tiny, tiny little debossing throughout the surface of the McCoy silk specifically. And we do that intentionally so that when the light hits it, it's like a controlled scatter across the surface. So we actually imprint that silk finish on that surface. And we have some
And that's
examples.
really, and
Yeah.
that's in the McCoy line, for us, the silk is the best selling for us, because it's a true silk because of what they do to the process. I think the other thing we have to be a little wary of out there is people calling things silk that aren't really silk. I guess one category we didn't really touch on was mill branded versus private labels. I mean, has everybody heard that term before? So Sappi McCoy is, you know, is a premium mill branded product. There's other products out there that merchants, you know, I told you what Linda Monroe does, where they use their own name. They'll just make a brand. They'll call it Sky Gloss, and then they'll shop the specs, and it'll be a different product every time. And you'll print it one time, and you say the same thing, and it looks totally different. It's because they took a private label and just put it on a product. So it's not, you don't get the repeatability. So when you ask questions, some of the questions we always insist you ask is, if you instead of just saying gloss, if you want to make sure it's repeatable, whatever, is it a mill brand? Now McCoy's a mill brand, so good. I want McCoy. You know, is it a private label or is it a mill brand? Mill brand offers you repeatability. You know, if it just doesn't matter, it's direct manual, I don't care, just put it on gloss. That's a different project. Or if you want it to look the same, run to run to run, that's when you want to make sure you specify a mill brand. Because not all brands you're out there are mill branded. Some of them are private labels. So we can help you with that. If you have questions, again, you can call or email us, we'll tell you. You know, and we represent just about everything, so we can tell you what it is. Everyone understand that?
Consistency.
That gets very confusing. We find a lot of, again, when we talk to designers and users, they say, well, I asked for this again and it looks totally different. Well, they changed mill sources on that. So that's why